you can go back to stories of Livy, the Roman historian describing Roman military campaigns, and he talks about flying shields, circular shields suddenly turning up in the middle of a battle, and we're not quite sure if they're engaging or observing. Whose are they, and how are they able to do that? Oannes on the Apkallu speaks about non-human entities arriving and teaching agriculture and civil engineering and mathematics, how to create legal systems, money systems, banking systems, all the accoutrements of civilization. We've got quite a range of entities there. Some are physical and some might be energy-based beings, archontic type beings. We did not evolve to what we are today without external assistance. We did not survive our extinction level events without external assistance. We did not develop the technologies we have today without external assistance. When we master technology that can manipulate space-time, which is exactly what we're working on right now, we become galactic neighbors instead of galactic subjects, and all the rules of engagement change at that, because all of a sudden we go from being citizens of a planet to citizens of a galaxy.
Paul Wallis, welcome back on Just Tap In, brother. What are you most excited about right now in your life?
G'day, Emilio. It's great to be with you once again, and hola, Colombia. What am I most excited about in my life right now? Well, it is that time in the year when I'm launching my book. So this is where everything is focused at the moment. The Eden Enigma is being released March 15th, 8 p.m. American Eastern Standard Time. And I'm excited about this book because, not just because it's my latest project, but because it's part of a journey that's taking me to new places. So up until now, my writing is really focused on paleocontact in ancestral narratives, and those narratives have come in the form of texts and indigenous story. Now I'm entering the world of ancient symbology, which opens up a whole new avenue. And the book, The Eden Enigma, has a different feel to the previous ones because it's more, I think it will feel more like a travel book, because we're really mainly in one place and I'm just taking the reader with me around these extraordinary sites. And it's new in another way that I am actually going to physically be taking people around these sites along with my friend Matt LaCroix. We're going to be doing tours of the areas of the region that I write about in the Eden Enigma. So September of this year, we'll be taking our first group to the Van province in Turkey. So these are all new things that are opening up for me. I mentioned before we came on air, we've moved house. So we're installing ourselves here, getting my new studio going, which gives me the opportunity to interview people face to face in the flesh. So that's something new that's opening up as well. So all sorts of things are happening that are really exciting.
Well, I love to feel your excitement before we get started, because I feel like that is the frequency that puts us on where we can really open up to the deeper topics of life. And as we record this, we're seeing a sky and a news full of unidentified objects, drones, UAPs. We're getting so many different, theories of what's going on. But I wanted to ask you, when we look back in history, what happened the last time that our sky was so filled with unanimous objects and things that we couldn't quite explain? What was the last time, or what happened the last time that our skies were this full?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, it's a fascinating question to ask. What exactly are our skies full of at the moment? That's what is puzzling people, because what has been filling our skies are craft that our military agencies, our air forces haven't been able to engage with. They haven't been able to sort of shoot them down or track them or work out whose they are. So there are a lot of question marks over them. We're seeing a lot of things that look rather like human technology, but whose, and how are they able to evade analysis? And then we're seeing some other things in the mix that actually we're not quite sure what that is that we're looking at. And so some people are wondering if a lot of the traffic is there as a sort of diversion from the other things that we can't explain. So heaps of question marks as to what exactly is filling our skies and whose it is. But as you rightly say, Emilio, it's not the first time this has happened. So you can go back to stories of Livy, the Roman historian, describing Roman military campaigns, and he talks about flying shields, circular shields suddenly turning up in the middle of a battle. And we're not quite sure if they're engaging or observing. And we've got the story of the Battle of Sigisburg from the annals of Charlemagne. And again, there's a battle going on and flying shields turn up. And whose are they? And how are they able to do that? This is in the 8th century, if I remember correctly. So we've been here before, seeing anomalous things, asking whose they are, not sure if it's human technology or someone else's. And then, of course, there was a dramatic acceleration of that kind of phenomenon following the detonations of atomic warheads. We're talking about Trinity and Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and that's when the flying saucers, as we call them, suddenly started filling our skies. The Second World War was another time when all of a sudden we were seeing things that we called Foo Fighters accompanying aerial forces. And again, the question was, whose are they? Where are they from? What are they do? Are they helping us, or are they just watching? Are they concerned that we're all about to nuke ourselves into oblivion? And this is in the Common Era, but I've found through my research for the Eden Enigma that these experiences of skies full of flying discs are even older. And I take the reader to Yerevan, which is the capital of modern Armenia, and we go up the hill to the Fortress of Blood, as it was known, Erebuni, and it was this great citadel that had been built by King Argisti as a celebration of Urartian power. This is the United Kingdom of Van, the Urartian people, otherwise known as the Bianili, and he's celebrating their presence and establishing them as the dominant military force by building this massive citadel facing Mount Ararat on the horizon, and filled it with art. And among that art was a blue sky full of flying discs. And historians have said, oh, that's just military shields. It's a celebration of their military power. Except you start connecting that with other symbology they're using. And these other stories I've mentioned of Livy and Charlemagne, of flying shields in the past. And I think that it's actually a reference to something that happened that was very significant to the progress of the human story in the wake of the most recent ice age. And as I drill down into the meaning of the symbols found carved in the sacred sites in the mountains of Turkey and Armenia, I argue that what we're looking at is the memory of another time when our skies were full of flying discs, because these shields are disc-shaped once again, and then they tell the stories of what happened next. And thankfully for them, what happened next was something positive, and it was an intervention to help humanity reboot in the wake of the most recent planetary cataclysm, and the full skies were just the prelude to all of that.
So it almost seems like history may be repeating itself. You know, we've had on a few astrologers talking about the great cycle, the 26,000 years. So
Yes.
Do you see that right now, this emergence of things that we can't explain filling our skies might be because they're an intervention of something that might happen, and that they're trying to help us shift the timeline out of?
Yes, I do think that is part of the story. There are many ancient stories that suggest that these interventions happen when humanity is in trouble. So if there's been a major climactic change, such as the most recent ice age, for instance, we've got stories like that we can find in Turkey and Armenia, but it's also something that echoes in stories you will hear from Native American traditions and Aboriginal Australian traditions. And these stories associate these visitors with a time in the deep past when their ancestors had either had to move somewhere for their survival, and now they didn't know the local flora and fauna, and they didn't know what was good to eat and what was good to avoid, and they didn't know how to farm in that environment. Either that had happened, or there had been a cataclysmic change in the environment, and they were having to learn from scratch how to survive. And I think this fits with what I was saying before about the spat of sightings in the Second World War, the spat of sightings, mass sightings, that followed the detonations of nuclear warheads in the 1940s. I think we get accelerated and intensified visits when our neighbors are concerned at what's happening on our planet, concerned that we might be about to nuke ourselves into oblivion. And these other stories from Turkey are about visitors coming because they're concerned whether humanity can survive in the wake of an ice age. And what's interesting about the ice age story is the stories appear to be concerning a reboot after. And the entities described in the stories of ancient Turkey are of advanced beings coming with some ability to manipulate weather, but then the skills they teach aren't to do with that. The skills they teach are to do with agriculture. We read the Babylonian story, it echoes that. Oannes on the Apkallu speaks about non-human entities arriving and teaching agriculture and civil engineering and mathematics, how to create legal systems, money systems, banking systems, all the accoutrements of civilization. And what I find interesting about that is that it makes these stories finite. You start putting detail on these stories and you realize these are not stories of gods in the way we might imagine gods. These are stories about visitors who have limited powers. They were not able to prevent the Younger Dryas Cold period happening, but they were able to turn up afterwards and lend a helping hand to get humanity moving again. And that's more comparable with our own technology, because we can't prevent a tsunami, but we can go in afterwards to help a country rebuild and recover. We can't prevent an earthquake, but we can go in afterwards to separate fresh water from salt water, rehabilitate land for farming, and get a culture moving again. Our abilities are now more comparable with the ancient stories told by the carvings in the mountains of Turkey, and give us a way of getting our heads around what our ancestors were speaking about. I think in the past, we supernaturalized all these stories, and we thought about the stories of the Anunnaki and the Tingir, which is the word used by the Urartian people, as if they were religious stories of idealized beings with unimaginable powers. But actually you get into the detail of it and know these are beings like you and me, but with a bit more tech, who were able to help humanity in a moment when our survival hung in the balance. And those are the stories that emerge as we get into the symbology left behind by ancient cultures.
I ran into this idea called the silent contact theory that I really wanted to hear your thoughts on. And it goes, what if these extraterrestrials that we're talking about, these groups, never actually left, or let's say our contact with them never actually ended, but it just went silent, where certain individuals or groups are still in communication? I would love to hear your thoughts on that, and if there are any indications or evidence as to who these groups that may still be in communication might be, and what types of conversations are still going on. Are we still trading technology? You know, these types of things that we can look at our ancient past and say, okay, this was going on. What if it's still going on, but not in the mainstream public?
Yes. Well, I certainly believe that in the present, there is contact behind closed doors, and I can get into more detail on that in a moment. But there have been other times, I think, when our ancestors wanted to maintain contact, but were unable to. And it was silent in a way they didn't want it to be silent. So I find that storyline in the Bible, for instance, when after the tribes of Israel have given Yahweh the boot, they've told him they don't want direct rule by him anymore. This happens in 1 Samuel 8. He sort of retreats and becomes a hidden hand in geopolitics, and is still sort of calling the shots as to who he thinks should be king and what the foreign policy should be and what wars should be fought, etc. That continues through the first human king in the Hebrew story, Saul, and the second human king in the Hebrew story, David, except that you read the detail of David's experience and he does not have face-to-face contact with Yahweh anymore. He has to use a prophet, a mediator, who by some modalities, not quite explained to us, is able to get messages to and from Yahweh. So now we're getting into the world of remote communication. And then the Ark of the Covenant is described as a tool for remote communication. And you look at the modalities used by the priests in the Holy of Holies when that was tents, and the Holy of Holies when it was a building. They're using all kinds of what they're called aromatic oils. And we're really talking about mind-altering substances to get them into an altered state of consciousness with the hope that they can do this remote communication thing as well. So those are the stories of a culture trying to deal with the disappearance of their powerful one, their Elohim, and trying to achieve remote communication. In my book, The Invasion of Eden, I give another example of that pattern, which was the kings and queens of the Jaguar dynasty in Mesoamerica, who were doing bloodletting ceremonies to achieve an altered state of consciousness so that they could communicate with the feathered serpents and so govern with information from them and with their authority. It's the same pattern. The feathered serpents are not around anymore, but the kings and queens have to be seen as their successors, and they're wanting to tap their wisdom. So they're going to all these great lengths. Queen Shuk was a Jaguar king, and when you see her in a carving showing the remote communication exercise, she's wearing something that looks like a Bluetooth, but to get it to work, she's having to do a bloodletting ceremony. And that, to me, hints at the possibility that they've even seen remote communication technology used by the feathered serpents, and they're trying to replicate it, and they're trying to get it to work. And I didn't find anything quite so graphic as that in Turkey, but what I did find were modalities to do with light and special potions aimed at, I believe, continuing the contact with the Tingir of their pantheon. So the leader of their Tingir, the advanced ones, was Haldi, and then his consort was Arubani, Ilmushini, Shuni. They were all credited with this vital intervention in the past, and things were built in dedication to them. The king said they were building doorways for them all to return through them. And so you can see everything's oriented around the hope that we'll have future contact. And I suggest they had these other modalities that they used in their sanctuaries to try and achieve that from year to year through special ceremonies. So that's slightly different to what you were asking about, because that's real silence, which they're trying to break through. And yet I think there are evidences to be found that the powerful ones are not absent from our world today, and that there is contact going on behind closed doors. It's something I unpacked in greater detail in my previous book, The Invasion of Eden, where I just shine a light on the conversations that have been going on in the USA between Congress and US military intelligence. And there's a bit of a tussle over how much military intelligence has to disclose to Congress, how much it can say about what's called the legacy program, which is the reverse engineering of artifacts from UAPs. But when all that blew up a couple of years ago with a public hearing, televised hearing of Congress's House Oversight Subcommittee on July the 26th, it suddenly became clear there was a whole lot more going on than just reverse engineering bits and pieces that we've picked up from events. And when you put those conversations alongside what we've heard from physicists working on the program, people like Jacques Vallée, Gary Nolan, and then from the former chief of French security, Alain Gillet, and then from the former chief of Israel's space security program, and then when you listen to the former Minister of Defense for Canada, Paul Hellyer, the former Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, a picture begins to emerge that not only are we playing with their stuff, but we're playing with their stuff with assistance. So I think, yes, we have contact on certain terms behind closed doors in the present at that kind of level. But there'll be people listening in today, I reckon, Emilio, who can tell you from their own experience that there is a presence and contact right now. I know I'm contacted every week by people, and sometimes it's many people every day, wanting to share their contact experiences with me that suggest to me that contact isn't just with the military intelligence higher-ups or people in covert government. It's actually happening with the whole of humanity, as it always has. And I think there's been a great acceleration of contact in recent years. And that can be for a couple of reasons. It might be because they're concerned once again that we are threatening our own sustainability on the planet, one way or another. But it might also be because there's always been a plurality of demographics who seem to feel they have a stake in Project Earth. And I think the accords between them of non-disclosure are leaking at the edges in a way we've not seen before. And there might just be a bit of a tussle in terms of shaping up how they want Project Earth to move forward. And I feel that is actually where we're at in 2025.
Another organization that we can bring to the surface is, I heard you say that 2025 is going to be the most embarrassing year for the Christian churches with regard to the process of disclosure and ET contact. In what way do you think that it would be embarrassing as more of this is coming to light? Why would it be, an embarrassing year for the Christian churches? Hello, beautiful family. Quick one today. I just wanted to take a moment to thank each and every one of you that have subscribed to this channel. Your subscription means more than you know. Even though it's free, what you're doing is you're empowering a whole channel to be able to do this every single day and continue showing up in the way that we can with all of our resources on hand. Thank you for contributing to the growth of this channel, for sharing it with the people that you love, for creating a conscious movement of individuals that are seeking the sovereignty and the divinity of their soul. This is why we're here. And if you haven't already and you're enjoying this content, I invite you now to look below on that little button that says subscribe and welcome you properly to this community. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being who you are and being pure love and radiating that with everyone that you see. Back to the episode.
Well, I think for a couple of reasons. I think this topic has more people's attention than ever before. And I think the new administration in the USA means there's going to be more public conversation about this than ever before. And I think there's going to be more leakage of disclosure than ever before. And it's going to put more pressure on the churches than ever before to please have a position statement on what's happening. I mean, I think it's pretty poor that that hasn't happened so far, given how far-reaching that hearing was that I mentioned before. This was the one that followed the David Grush complaint, the Congressional House Oversight Subcommittee hearing. Because there are believers all around the world asking their pastors and pastors asking their bishops, what's our position on this? Does the church believe we have company? And if we do, what are the theological implications of that? And so far, the churches have been all but silent on that. I think even more shameful than that, our churches are full of people, as I was just saying, who've had experiences which are often very frightening, very disturbing, worldview changing. They're experiences that people can't just go around talking to all their friends and family about because they know they're going to be treated as crazy. And so they should be able to go to their pastors and say, I've experienced this thing, how do I process it? But they can't, because their pastors are getting zero guidance on how to respond to it. And I know that churches around the world have specialists in ministry who are designed to help pastors respond to people having paranormal experiences. That's great. So what about the people who've had close encounters? Well, they're to be gaslighted. And that's really pretty much what happens at the moment. And I know that within the Church of England, there are continual requests for position statements on my work, on these phenomena, and people are being laughed at when they're asking for that, which I just think is really shameful. So if we do see an acceleration of disclosure, which I think is inevitable, that pressure is going to increase, and the wrongness of the churches not responding is just going to become even more embarrassing. There was a little false start in this process, 2009, by the Roman Catholic Church, when they held a colloquium. Now, this was under Pope Benedict XVI, who's the most conservative pope in my lifetime, so I was blown away when this happened. He commissioned the Pontifical Academy of Sciences to hold a 5-day symposium called a colloquium, so a gathering of top theologians and scientists, to discuss the theological implications of contact. And they prepared people for about a year before this happened, telling them this is what they're going to be talking about. And then for about a year following, senior figures for the Curia were doing press conferences and writing articles, preparing people for contact. And their message was, oh, there's no theological problem with this. It just means the Creator's been busier than we thought, and we should be ready to embrace a brother or sister alien. And in fact, the Pope said I would baptize them if they asked, which was really a very provocative way of saying, just start processing the implications of contact. And Reverend Dr. Guy Consolmagno, who is one of these spokespeople, senior astronomer for the Vatican Observatory, said very provocatively, we should not be surprised to encounter intelligent alien life, visits from other civilizations, because he said it's in the Bible. It's in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And that was a call to pastors and theologians everywhere to go back to the Bible and read it with a more open eye and start asking, who are all the entities named in the texts? Who are the Elohim, the powerful ones? What was the Tseva Hashemayim, the airborne fleet that arrived? What was this council meeting in Deuteronomy 32, where the lands were divided up among powerful beings who then governed over human beings? What is that all about? So the call was made, and then very quickly it went quiet again. When it happened, it gave the appearance that the Roman Catholic Church was wanting to get on the front foot before disclosures of contact should come, and it looked like they were expecting that to come quite quickly, and then it didn't, and then it all went quiet. Now, if you try and Google Reverend Dr. Guy Consolmagno Monsignor Corrado Balducci, Father Jose Gabriel Funes. You try
If you can first figure out how to spell those names.
Oh, well, put them in the video description, Emilio, or you can buy my book, The Invasion of Eden. And if you Google those, you're not going to find those interviews today. Go onto YouTube, you won't find those interviews, you won't find those articles. So it went that quiet because disclosures were not made. But at least when they thought something was going to happen, they made that bold step. And they sort of laid the foundation for others to do it, and others haven't done it. Except I thought, okay, I need to jump into this. The churches are not grasping the nettle. Believers are still doing this with regard to populated universe, and they're not reading the texts. And that's why I wrote the Eden series, to keep that conversation moving forward and to tell people all around the world, whether they're believers or not, that this is a topic worth taking seriously and to begin adjusting to it now before disclosure becomes completely unavoidable.
Your journey is a very fascinating one because you had a 33-year career in ministry as a theological educator, church doctor, and archdeacon in Australia. And what's fascinating is if you were in that position now, today, and someone were to go to you for, counsel of like, hey, this is happening to me. Like, I've had my own experiences. Like, I left the Great Pyramid at midnight and I saw a craft hovering above, triangle shaped. Like, I've talked about it before on the podcast. I've had my own experiences, and I've talked to people who literally every night get taken to a council in their dreams when there's just a bunch of other extraterrestrials talking about, the future of humanity, the Galactic Federation, we might call it. What would you say to them today if they were to come to you and you were still in that role as an archdeacon? How would you provide, a sense of, counsel and hope and advice in that way?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is you're in very good company. Millions of people all around the world are having these experiences. I take them very seriously. And I would ask the person how they understood the experience and give them permission, not only to describe the experience, but to draw some conclusions about it and show them that they are not being required to edit that experience or frame it in a particular way, that they need to acknowledge it, acknowledge how it made them feel at the time, how it makes them feel now, the questions it's thrown up for them, and reassure them that I'm very happy to journey with them through all the questions that it's thrown up. The problem wouldn't be in the pastoral moment. The problem would be probably a couple of Sundays hence, when I'd have a small posse of people at the end of my church service saying, "What did you say to Emilio the other day?" Because they might be worried, thinking that I had affirmed you in your experience, because it's now challenging their beliefs, or it's challenging what they think my beliefs should be. And I think in a congregation, you're always going to have a mix of opinions, a mix of preparedness for this kind of conversation. In most congregations, if the pastor's put on the spot and says, "Look, I think we're being visited by ET company that are other species similar to ourselves but more advanced, and I think they're named in the Bible, and I think a lot of the stories we've taken as God's stories are really stories of contact in the deep past," well, it probably wouldn't be too long before you'd be in an emergency meeting about whether you can carry on as pastor of that church. I was very fortunate that I was not serving a congregation when my research took me into the world of paleocontact and convinced me of these things, because it would be very inhibiting thinking, I've got to keep a lid on this, and if I don't, then I'm going to split my church. So I decided, look, I have this luxury of being in between congregations, so let me steward the opportunity. And of course, it's taken me to a place where I'm probably not likely to be hired by another Orthodox Christian community because they know this issue would be too divisive for a congregation. So this is the position I'm still in. So I'm still a priest, I'm still in holy orders, but I'm making the most of the fact I'm not leading a congregation by putting this research out there for any person, believe it or not, to read and begin doing business with. And it's why I have such a full inbox every morning of people who've either had experiences, or they're following the news, or they've seen things in ancient texts, including the Bible, and they're now in a journey of unlearning and relearning. And people come to me because they can't go to pastors of congregations for all the reasons I've just described.
Recently you spoke out against a little bit of the debate that our friend Billy Carson had with Wes Huff. And, I'm only bringing this up because there were some things in that conversation that were not clarified. And you've spoken a little bit about, there's some ideas that were brought up, and then quickly through the moderation, it was taken on a different direction. But there are certain ideas in the Bible, regarding, one of the main characters, Jesus, Yeshua, that are a little bit misunderstood. And I would love to hold the space to clarify some of those things that maybe weren't able to be really spoken about clearly in that conversation. And one of those being specifically, I brought in, one of my main guides is Mary Magdalene. And I know she's very connected to Jesus in those stories, and maybe even was his partner. What are your thoughts on that, and how can we create more of a unified picture with your evidence, with your interpretation that may allow us to see it in a new way?
Yes, I think one of the things that made that conversation a very frustrating watch is that if you pitch an apologist against a writer of esoterica, those are two completely different agendas, two completely different reasons to be interested in ancient texts. And so you're always going to end up talking at cross purposes, which I think was part of what happened. But one of the topics, and I agree with what you're just saying, Emilio, I think it could have been a really interesting conversation if the moderator had just held the conversation on the topics raised long enough for the topics to be discussed. And one of the topics was to do with this fragment that was found of a gospel, and the fragment has been called the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. It's just a tiny little fragment, and it was analyzed by Karen King, who's one of the world's leading experts in Gnostic documents. She's a professor at Harvard, and she analyzed this text and felt that it probably was authentic, and she submitted it to the Harvard Theological Review. They analyzed it, and they said, yes, there's no evidence of fakery or forgery here. What made it controversial was what it said, that it used this phrase for Mary Magdalene, Jesus' wife. And obviously, shock horror, that's not in the canonical Gospels. Jesus wasn't married there. And there was some pushback when it was first talked about. And very quickly, there was pushback from the Vatican, which said, well, this can't be right. Well, they weren't the ones with the fragment. They weren't the ones who'd done the work on it. How could they know if it was right or not, if it was fake or not? Harvard was the institution that had the document and that had done the work. So why is there this reaction? Well, of course, in the canonical Gospels, Jesus is presented as single, but there are other texts from early Christianity that have a more interesting picture. So if you read Pistis Sophia, or the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, or the Gospel of Philip, the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene becomes rather more prominent. Mary Magdalene is more than an extra or an NPC in the story of Jesus. She is a partner. She is a special friend of some kind, and she has a teaching role. And so much so that there is conflict between her and Peter, who is annoyed that Mary seems to be getting the lowdown on some teachings that he's not getting from Jesus. And there's a little bit of political argy-bargy surrounding her. So these are very interesting stories. If, as an apologist, you want to drill down to, yes, but what really happened, then you will go at those texts in a certain way. And you'll be very interested in, yes, but when were they written? And which were the communities of faith that produced these? And they were excluded from the canon after all. And that's sort of the line you'll take. Whereas if you are interested in the kaleidoscope of early Christianity, which I am, I want to know, what were the first Christian beliefs? What was the spectrum of Christian belief? Then I will go to those texts with completely different questions. And my questions are, how is it that there were communities of faith for whom there was no issue at all, no problem in understanding Jesus to have had a girlfriend, or maybe even to have been married? The Gospel of Philip is the one that says that Jesus would kiss Mary frequently on the, and then the word has been scratched out. The scholars are pretty sure.
Rated R.
Yeah, but the word was actually mouth or lips. But this couldn't be read. It had been scratched out. And that shows you the controversy, that there were communities of faith for whom this was not an issue or a problem at all. And then other communities of faith who said, no, this is taboo, and we don't want this spoken about, or we don't agree with it, or we don't believe in it. And so I'm interested in exploring that. Why was it a problem for one set of communities and not a problem for another set of communities? And then I might also be interested to work out, well, what did really happen? Were they partners? Were they married? And where does that go? And I think the esoteric traditions that stuck with what we find in the Gnostic Gospels are deeply, deeply interesting, and suggest to me that there was profound and powerful teaching attached to these communities that did see Jesus in a relationship. So this is all something I'm interested in exploring, and it didn't get explored in the Wes Huff and Billy Carson debate, which was frustrating. And it fell over the question of whether or not the Karen King fragment is authentic or not. If it proves not authentic, then it doesn't really matter, because we do have these other texts that go just a fraction of an inch away from saying that they were married, so we can still talk about that topic. But I think the things that have been brought out to gainsay that fragment haven't falsified it. The things I'm aware of that have been said are that there's a convention of writing, of using bold lettering, that is not early. That is not something that belongs to the 300s, which is the date being ascribed to the original source. Well, that's fine, because we're dealing with a copy, so that's not really falsifying it. And then others have analyzed it and said, oh, we think there's a dependence on the Gospel of Thomas here. But that doesn't falsify it. I mean, Matthew and Luke are dependent on Mark. That doesn't falsify Matthew and Luke. So it hasn't been debunked in the way that Wes Huff suggested. But if you go onto Wikipedia, that's what you'll read. The debunked fragment. But as I say, we can put that aside even and still go back to the question of the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. What did it mean to these communities of faith that produced these documents? And what did it mean to the Orthodox tradition that they had to rule it out? And in the words of Bart Ehrman, why does it matter? Why does it matter if Jesus was in a relationship? What do we think that changes?
And beyond just the characters of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, looking at it at a wider scope, what does that say about the potency and the power of when the divine masculine comes into union with the divine feminine? I think that's even a bigger topic if you have any insight into that.
Well, it's something I need to study more deeply, but it's certainly an important theme within Gnostic Christianity. And I think it was really a recovery of balance after a long period of masculinization of Judaism, and then that continued into Christianity. So before the great reforms of Judaism in the 8th to 6th century BCE, which turned Judaism into Yahweh's monotheism, before that, it was, well, scholars might say it was polytheistic or henotheistic. I would say it was a canon of paleo-contact, and that among the beings being honored and remembered for the assistance they'd given to humanity were males and females. And the most popular advanced being honored by Jewish believers prior to those reforms was Asherah, a female entity credited with the gift of agriculture and all the accoutrements of civilization that flowed from that. That all got stamped out. And so Asherah was sort of demonized and made a totem of sort of spiritual wickedness, whereas in fact the people had remembered her quite differently to that. And so all that female wisdom that she represented, and not just for her own intervention in the past, but the things she taught, the basics of agriculture and medicine. In traditional cultures, these are often the things that women teach to each new generation of a culture. So it really was pushing female wisdom out of the picture. And now we've only got one God, and he's a male, and he's a man of war. And so you've got a masculinized religion really designed, I would argue, to empower the kings and the high priestly family. And that, unfortunately, I think was the worldview that then got taken up by early Christianity. And so all that forgetting of female wisdom and female entities in the past who were so important became sort of recodified in early Christianity. And of course, female wisdom, oh dear. You think of how Christianity has handled that through the ages. I mean, just starting off in that way seems to have pointed the church in a very unhappy direction, where you've only got female teachers in the church, and where if you've got female people exercising traditional wisdom, if they offend the wrong person, well, they're a witch, and the church is going to arrest them and burn them to death. And we've had periods of that. So I think the decisions that were taken to masculinize religion back in the day, the 8th to 6th century BCE, have far-reaching consequences, and that's something we need to unpick. And I do think that the Gnostic emphasis on marrying the masculine and feminine wisdom was intended to help humanity recover from this long period of really quite abusive masculinized religion.
Yeah. And in your eyes, I wanted to ask you, what do you feel was the original idea of resurrection in biblical texts?
Oh, this is fascinating. This is absolutely fascinating, because if you talk about resurrection in the church today, there is a mainstream orthodox understanding of what that means. And it means physical, bodily resurrection. If we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about the reanimation of his corpse in a way that transforms it to become indestructible. And then that body is taken up into the sky to reside in the heavens at the right hand of the Father. That's the mainstream Orthodox view. And that view emerges towards the end of the production of the documents that become canonical scriptures. So we find it in Matthew, Luke, and John. Here's a resurrected Jesus who can eat food, cook meals, and you can touch his wounds. But that's not the earliest version of resurrection, as you're hinting, in the New Testament. If we go to the earliest writings that we have in the New Testament, we're going to Paul's letters. And when he talks about resurrection, he doesn't understand it that way at all. He says that the material body dies and decomposes. He says, he uses a different word, corruptible, but that's what he's talking about. The material body decomposes, but we go on as a spiritual body, he says. And this is actually far closer to mainstream international thought at that time, mainstream Greek thinking. It's pretty much what Plato taught. He taught that we are primarily, essentially, beings of consciousness, and that before we have this material life, we existed as aspects of the consciousness of the cosmos, aspects of divine consciousness, and then we individuate. Then we become material beings, we have this material experience, then our material bodies expire, but we go on as beings of consciousness. We have a life review, how do you feel that went? And then we either go on to a completely different experience or we go round another time. So that was the mainstream thought. Plato unpacked it in his writings. And this is what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 15, which is the text believers always go to say this says the historicity of the bodily resurrection is vital. He doesn't say that at all. His understanding is our bodies die and then we carry on as spiritual entities, is his language, spiritual bodies. And when he describes his encounter with the risen Jesus, he doesn't describe an encounter with a reanimated body. He experiences light. He experiences a voice. He experiences love and restoration, if we take the Acts version of his story as speaking for Paul. That was his experience. And he equates his own experience with the appearances to Peter, James, the 12, the apostles. That seems to be 2 different groups in his list. And to more than 500 people at one time, he says. So he's equating this experience of love and light with what all those people experienced and called resurrection. And that's the earliest explanation we have in the New Testament. And it is different to the later Matthew, Luke, and John explanations of resurrection appearances, which are physical body reanimations. And Mark shouldn't be in that list because Mark doesn't have resurrection appearances in it in its original form.
And I know you're also an expert in hermeneutics. What is the actual root meaning of that word of resurrection? Maybe, hitting it from a different perspective.
Well, the words used, it's a great question, that, and I love root meanings. So yes, I'm a hermeneutics guy, and that's what I taught pastors for 15 years. Hermeneutics is the principles of interpreting ancient texts. And one of the most important principles is to ask what the words mean. So you've asked the $64,000 question. And there are 2 words that the New Testament uses for resurrection. And one simply means to arise. It's the same word that's used for when you get up in the morning. Wake up, get up, arise. That's the word that's used. But when we see it, and we see it translated as resurrection or has risen, of course, click, 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 2,000 years of doctrine suddenly clicks into place. That's what they mean. And we've got to be very careful of reading the developed doctrine into the word, the original word. The original word just means woke up, got up. And the other word that's used simply means was again or stood again. So these are, I think they're beautiful words, but they don't go quite as far as spelling out all the later emerged doctrine of bodily resurrection. It just says he was again in some way.
In some way. And I've been practicing all day to say this word, so this is the moment of truth. Dingir, found in the Sumerian text, and we also then have the word of the Elohim in Hebrew. What is the relationship between the Dingir and the Elohim? Have you found a connection there? Could these have been the same advanced beings that once visited Earth and had a huge influence on us?
Yes, so these words are much sort of broader and more general. Elohim simply means the powers or the powerful ones. Although I put the in, it just means powerful ones if you go to the component parts of the word. And Anunnaki is a similar word that implies ones who have come from the heavens to the earth. It gets used to refer to rulers, and a lot of conventional Assyriologists will say that's what it means. But no, that's its usage. If you really try to break the word down, it does suggest this heaven to earth journey. And so we might think of the word Anunnaki as astronauts. Or we might say ETs, just because they have come from the sky to the earth. And Dingir, it's spelt Dingir, but it's pronounced Tingir, is the word that if I go to Turkey and I listen to the writings in cuneiform script of the Urartu people, that's the name given to their advanced beings. So these words don't pin down exactly who or what they are, where they're from, if it's a single demographic or many. And certainly in the Bible, the Elohim seems to embrace many kinds of powerful ones, many kinds of advanced beings. So there's a moment when the prophet Micaiah in 1 Kings 22 remote views the Sky Council, and it looks like we've got, it's almost like the Star Wars bar scene. We've got quite a range of entities there. Some are physical and some might be energy-based beings, archontic type beings. But the Tingir of Urartian story seem to be very three-dimensional, concrete, physical beings. They're the ones who came and taught humanity how to rebuild a working ecosystem. They're the ones who came and re-established human beings in the wake of the Younger Dryas Cold period. And they are described in physical terms, but with these phenomena that created a sense of wonder among the people. And the Tingir are remembered for being amazing, advanced beings who are venerated. But through the ages, we've translated the word Tingir as gods. And the problem with translating them that way is that when you and I hear the word gods, our minds instantly go to the fantastical. They go to religious ideas. They go to transcendent ideas. Suddenly we think we're imagining some ethereal, spiritual, transcendent being, when in fact, that's not what Tingir ever suggested. It describes them as quite finite beings doing finite and specific things. And that's why I think it's important to get into the stories and ask, what did they look like? What did they do? How are they remembered? And start using less religious language to describe it so that we can snap these stories back into something closer to how they were understood in the beginning.
Do you think that they really ran around with wings, feathered wings on their backs?
Well, this is the great joy of symbology, of decoding what all these symbols mean. And it's why I've called my new book The Eden Enigma. Enigma, of course, being about code breaking. And I think there are a number of symbols that are used that are figurative. There are others that are very concrete. So I believe the wings are figurative of being able to fly. I don't think the Tingir were human beings with feathered wings on their back. They are portrayed that way, and not just by the Urartians. The ancient Assyrians portrayed them in exactly the same way. I think it indicates they had flight technology. When we see a flying disc in the sky, and we can find one of these in a carving at the from the palace of Ashur-nasirpal II from Assyria, you have a disc, you have a person in the disc is in the sky, and the disc has wings. And I think the wings are there to say the disc could fly. I think that's what's going on there. And we have other symbology that suggests sort of interdimensional travel, and that's the symbol of the ziggurat. And then, of course, we've got the flying discs, which I mentioned earlier. But there are carvings that I think show something very concrete that is still totemic, that's still symbolic, that's still a metaphor for something, but is actually showing something very concrete. And it's a metaphor for these people came and they lit the blue touch paper for civilization. It's a metaphor for that, but what it shows them doing is hand pollinating plants. And I think that is meant
with the pine cone, like
quite
this.
literally. That's right. So they've got the pine cone, the mulilu, and they've got their dalam or bandudu. And what they're doing is they're using this as an applicator, and they're hand pollinating very carefully these plants, which are portrayed almost as if in laboratory conditions. And that was the key gift that Tingir gave to the ancestors of the Urartians in the region of the planet that so many ancient narratives say this is where humanity was rebooted, this is where agriculture got restarted. We have this confirmed by DNA research and archaeological research as well. This is where modern farming began, and these carvings show us how. That plants were either brought from another environment into this one, or the plants that had survived weren't pollinating because of the catastrophe that had befallen the ecosystem. And if you've got a world without insects, a world without the right kind of bee, you're not going to have harvests, you're going to starve to death. And this has been dramatized in countless movies by now. And the Tingir said, no, it doesn't have to end this way. We can hand pollinate these plants, produce new strains of plant that will grow in this new environment, and you will have farms again. And that's the story about the Tingir that we read in the cuneiform inscriptions, and that story is totemized by that image of these winged beings hand pollinating plants. And it's an image that you can find around the world. The pine cone and the bucket and the tree of life, that is the story that's being told in its original form.
What association of this symbol of the pine cone have you had with the pineal gland in our brain?
Yes, well, this is really intriguing. People have looked at that symbol and said it clearly refers to an intervention to support the progress of humanity. And people do believe it's about a cognitive upgrade because of this correspondence of the pine cone with the pineal gland. And I think it may have come to mean that symbol may have become a shorthand for all the benefits that the Tingir brought, all the upgrades to the human experience that they enabled. And I think a knowledge of pineal activation is something that's very, very ancient. But I argue in the Eden Enigma that the original message of those carvings had to do with hand pollination. And that was the blue touch paper that the Urartians remembered and that I explore in the Eden Enigma.
And it's fascinating because it's almost like they bestowed upon this knowledge that we still carry out today. Like we still cross-pollinate different plants. We have that knowledge. Breeding, we turned wolves into dogs. Psychedelics, yes. If you look at the Peruvian tribes, they describe how their ancestors knew to cross this vine with this other plant and then create a DMT altering substance. Yes. It's almost like that knowledge was pretty much passed down by these builders of civilization. Was this after the flood?
Yes, I think this was after fire events and flood events associated with the Younger Dryas and with other cataclysms that had happened previously. And what you've just said is what is there in ancient story, but it is confirmed by modern science as well. So the work of Manfred Hoyne and the teams from the University of Norway in Aarhus and the Max Planck Institute of Cologne, Germany, have identified a very local place within what was ancient Armenia, what is now southeast Turkey, and they've identified the place where modern farming began. And as you rightly say, it's not just cross-pollination, it's not just gene modification to turn naturally occurring plants into cultivatable crops, it's animal husbandry as well. And they've identified Karajada as the place where all of a sudden this was happening, and happening really intensely and really locally. And they argue this is ground zero for modern agriculture. And this has been confirmed not only by ancient story, but by DNA research that has been able to track the migration of people from Anatolia across to the West into Europe. And I talk about a story of a body being discovered under the floor of a bar in Northern Ireland that showed that there had been this migration from about 8,500 years ago from Anatolia in that direction, taking with it modern agriculture and megalithic building. And so the DNA record points to Anatolia as ground zero. The archaeological paleo-agricultural work of Manfred Hoyne and the team point to that place as ground zero. The Bible identifies it as ground zero in the story of Noah and Ararat. The Mesopotamian story of Yesudra points to the same place. We've got an ancient Mesopotamian artifact. It's a 3,000-year-old tablet that also identifies this is the place where this happened. And so I gather a lot of this data together in the Eden Enigma and say, how many vectors do you need pointing to this part of the world and telling the same story before we begin to take it seriously? But as I say, the Younger Dryas is just one of a number of extinction-level events. And I do get into some of the others in the Eden Enigma as well. There's a very interesting period in human history, because we were on the planet at this time 42,000 years ago, an event called the Lachamp excursion, which is where the geomagnetic field of the planet weakened and the North Pole, the magnetic North Pole, started wandering. And it wandered all the way to where the South Pole is today, and stayed there for a few hundred years and then flipped back. And you might think, does that matter? I mean, unless you're using compasses, does it really matter that that happened? And the answer is yes. The impacts were enormous. Not so much of the pole moving, but the weakened geomagnetic field. It meant that all of a sudden the planet was being bombarded with ultraviolet rays at an intensity that was very damaging to the megafauna living on the planet's surface. 42,000 years ago is a period of mass extinctions. It's also a time when human behavior changed and people around the planet started coating themselves in clay. In parts of the world, coating themselves in red ochre, because that was their sunscreen to protect themselves from the changed conditions. And human beings moved indoors at that time. And now we know why, because they were living through an extinction level event. And when we go to the ancient cave paintings of Chauvet and Lascaux in France, we're looking at images from that period. And we're looking at pictures of all the megafauna that were extincted through that period. And so we are seeing the human depiction of human memory of another extinction level event. And the ancient stories suggest we've always been a curated species. There's always been help at hand when these moments come. But again, it makes these visitation stories finite, because our visitors weren't able to stop the Lachamp excursion. They weren't able to stop the Younger Dryas, but they did come to help us survive and help us rehabilitate. And these are the stories I take seriously. And the more correlations you hear from continent to continent, culture to culture, all carried at the folkloric layer, the more correlations you hear, the more you start taking the stories seriously.
And in modern day, we rely, on most of our energy on petroleum and gas. And when you go to those ancient sites, the Eurasian sites, you describe that they had a combination of basalt, magnetic properties, and running water. Could have these been designed in some sort of way to affect the bioenergetic fields? You also mentioned piezoelectric properties in these buildings that could even manipulate consciousness, the electromagnetism of the planet, how they were getting energy. These are like really different technologies than what we're used to run our houses and our energy systems.
Yes, they are. Now, in terms of sourcing energy, I haven't really probed that topic, although I really want to. But
Book 7.
Yeah, book 7, that's right. But what I did find going around some of these incredible sites in Turkey is the effect on the human body of water flowing over dense magnetic rock. It creates a kind of electric field that the body picks up on. And how you experience it, it's not like static electricity. You just feel more awake and more alert and calm at the same time. And ancient civil engineers understood this. Ancient architects understood this. And this meant that often they would construct buildings and design it for water to flow over dense magnetic rock so that the sacred space would have that feeling and would heighten the consciousness of anyone walking into that space. And what we found in the ancient United Kingdom of Van was that those who built the citadels there built on sites where they could achieve that easily. So they were building on a dense bedrock of magnetic rock, and then they would create these aquifers so that it had this effect. And I went to 2 places where I walked across the threshold into the sacred space, and before I physically realized I'd done that, I could feel the difference in my body. And I just stopped both times and thought, okay, what just happened? What has changed? And then I looked around and saw the physical markers of this kind of technology. So it's technology that's been known a long, long time. It was something I first came across actually when I was studying the Benedictine tradition. This was in my days of emerging church and neo-monasticism. And I understood that in the Trappist tradition, which is part of the Cistercian tradition, which is part of the Benedictine tradition, there was a long tradition of building your monastic cloisters on dense magnetic rock, close to flowing water, and hopefully with a water view. That was what they always aimed for, because they found that people could live the most austere of lives on the lowest of budgets, but still feel like they were kings of the world, still feel wealthy, still feel healthy if they were living in that environment. And if you go and stay in some of these classic monastic cloisters, you will feel it yourself. When you go and stay in these places, you will say, oh my goodness, I could live here forever. It feels wonderful here. And it's not just because of the rule of life and the spiritual tradition of the place. It's to do with the physical properties of what they built and where they built it. And this knowledge is ages old, and we certainly found it in ancient Turkey.
And if we touch again on the topic of alien contact, I want to understand why you've said that our ancestors have prepared us exactly for this moment that we're living today.
Yes, I think they have, because they've shown us what contact has looked like in the past. They've shown us what overt contact looks like and what covert contact looks like. And they've shown us that we've always lived in a soup of company, and that company represents a diversity of agendas, that there will always be galactic neighbors who like our planet more than they like the people on the planet. And so there's always that vulnerability to exploitation, and we have many stories of that in the Bible, in the Mayan stories, in African story all around the world describes that scenario. But I find more numerous are the stories that speak of ancient help, that tell us that we have always had galactic support, that we have always been a curated species, that we did not evolve to what we are today without external assistance, that we did not survive our extinction level events without external assistance, that we did not develop the technologies we have today without external assistance. And I find that those stories ought to give us confidence in addressing the question of who's in our skies right now, what are the conversations happening behind closed doors, what's the covert contact in the 21st century, because it tells us that we have friends in high places, that even if we've got neighbors who would want to be exploitative towards us and our planet, we have powerful friends in high places who have kept those forces at least somewhat at bay, and that we need to be intelligent in our approach towards contact. If the general public do this, then how can they expect to be in the loop? And if they're not in the loop, how can they expect to hold our visible powers to account? And if we will not educate ourselves about the spectrum of contact that's there, how do we make intelligent decisions about who our friends are and who can best support the human experience to lead towards a better future rather than a worse one?
And touching again on the symbology that we've talked about, there's one symbol that has stood the test of time, which is the cross. And I know that you and Matt LaCroix went into Ayanis, and you found a lot of these depictions of different crosses. What are some of those original meanings that you found of this symbol of the cross that maybe have been, transformed in the years or misinterpreted, that if we were to get to the original meaning, it would make a lot more sense? What is your greatest understanding of what the cross is?
Well, I was introduced to the cross as a symbol when I became a Christian, and I assumed that the cross equaled the Christian cross, the cross on which Jesus was crucified. And I accepted all the stories around the cross that Christianity has attached through that story. What I didn't realize and failed to notice when I entered the world of ministry is that there was another cross that carries different stories that had nevertheless become part of Christian symbology and practice. So I didn't stop to ask, why is there a circle with a cross in it behind the head of Jesus and Mary and saints when they're depicted in ancient art? Why is there an equal-armed cross on top of the ciborium that holds the people's hosts, the wafers that we give at communion? Why is there a circle with an equal-armed cross on the wafer? And I did notice at the time that doesn't look like the crucifix. That doesn't look like the unequal cross of Jesus' crucifixion. What I didn't know was that that is the sun cross that the Emperor Constantine brought into Christianity, and that the sun cross was part of his religious practice prior to his adoption of Christianity. I failed to notice all these aspects of sun worship in Christianity. So the fact that if you're venerating an icon of Jesus and you're also venerating a symbol of the sun, I didn't pick that up. That the ciborium has a symbol of the sun, that the wafer has a symbol of the sun, that in the benediction ceremony you hold up a symbol of the sun with all these rays coming off this golden sun symbol, and then there's a sun cross in the middle of it. I didn't realize that we were doing sun worship with a thin veneer of Christianity over the top. I didn't stop to ask, Easter Sunday, so this is the first Sunday after the equinox, and we go and greet the rising sun with songs of resurrection. I didn't know that these are all ceremonies long predating Christianity. And the sun cross exists all around the world. Sometimes it represents the sun, but it seems to go deeper than that and represent the movement of the sun. And so it's come to be a symbol of the cycle of time, or a portal to another dimension. So these are still associated with the sun, but it's gone into another area. And so the medicine wheel is about the cycle of time, the cycle of the seasons. It is a sun cross. And this kind of cross is thousands of years old. You can go 8,000 years ago to the Vinca culture or the Danube culture, and they're using a sun cross, which is an equal arm cross that rotates, and so it becomes a swastika. In Turkey, we were seeing the sun cross, the cross in a circle. And you've got the 4-armed cross and the 8-armed cross in a circle. And there are layers of meaning that go back to ancient Sumer as to what that means. So this means tax. So the cross represents, I have to pay you. I am in perpetual debt to you. And this one means preeminence. The diagonal cross is the preeminent one. So you are now in charge of me, and I must obey you and do everything to please you. And so these meanings are carried. And bit by bit, I worked out that many of the associations with the cross that I thought were Christian associations long predated Christianity. So one that's come from the heavens, the heavenly body, that predates the communion wafer. One that I'm perpetually indebted to, that predates Jesus on the cross. One whom I must obey and continually please, that predates the cross of Jesus. And if we go even deeper than that and say, well, what did the cross mean in the beginning? Can we find the first ever cross? Well, now we're going back to that period 42,000 years ago, when the ancient French people are painting pictures of the megafauna being extincted by the Adams event, the La Champ excursion. Everything is representative in a way you can immediately recognize that's a bison, that's a horse, but now there's a symbol, and it's a cross, a rudimentary cross, but very deliberately carved and painted. What might that mean? And I think the most primitive meaning of the cross is if you can imagine drawing one for the first time in the dirt on the ground. If you're drawing this line, well, that's us moving through time. That's us here and now. That's the ground. And now all of a sudden you intersect it with a vertical line. Something above has come below. Something from beyond has come here. Something happened that cut our timeline into before and after. And I think that is actually the most primitive meaning of the cross. X marks the spot. Something happened here that changed everything. And that's the cross we find at Lascaux. And even those meanings have been imported into the Christian cross. Something above coming below. Something from the invisible becomes visible. Something happened that split time into before and after. And so I go into all those meanings, and I argue in the Eden Enigma that the original meaning of the cross is simply marking these percussive moments in the human story when everything changed. And the details of that are what I explore as I get into the cuneiform stories and the other symbols that we found in Turkey.
What would we need to live through in the coming years in order for us to mark an X? There is a before and after. What would need to happen in terms of events, in terms of maybe evolution of our consciousness? What would need to happen for us to mark another X in our history?
Well, there are lots of reasons why we might need to mark another X before too long. I think that our agricultural industries are playing with technologies that could be really damaging to our ecological viability. I think there is a war going on right now between two models of farming. one that could put us in a very precarious position in terms of our survival. And so that's one of the reasons why I go deep into the agricultural story in the Eden Enigma. And if we get that wrong, and if we allow certain industries to dominate, then we are really risking entering the gates of an extinction level event. And this was really preempted by Rachel Carson when she wrote her book Silent Spring in 1962, when she warned about what the petrochemical industry was doing to agriculture at that time. They'd found a new market for DDT, which had previously been used in chemical warfare. They were now using it as an insecticide. And the reason she talked about the Silent Spring was because all of a sudden, birds were disappearing. A silent spring is a spring with no bird song. They were disappearing because they were eating poisoned insects and dying. And then animals were eating the poisoned birds and dying. And she was saying, we are on the brink of an extinction level event here because we're going to be eating poisoned food, and we're going to poison ourselves. We're going to see new kinds of sickness, new levels of obesity as our bodies try to fight new diseases off. And that's exactly what's happened in the 60 plus years since. And she also said, a world without insects is a world without pollination. And there you are, really at the gates of an extinction level event. And we're still playing with things that could put us in that situation. I think we're in a very dangerous time in terms of warfare that could damage our ecosphere. We might want to mark an X because of what could unfold if we're not a little bit more intelligent about how we speak to each other, nation to nation. If we enter a period where our contact with others is finally acknowledged publicly, then that will certainly be a place to mark the X, because I am inclined to believe what I'm hearing from people with privileged information, which would include Hayam Ashed, Israel's former chief of space security, that identifies that moment with the moment when we master technology that can get us to travel through the galaxy. When we master technology that can manipulate space-time, which is exactly what we're working on right now, and we believe that is how the craft work that ping into our airspace. As soon as we do that, we become galactic neighbors instead of galactic subjects, and all the rules of engagement change at that point, I believe. X would mark the spot because all of a sudden we go from being citizens of a planet to citizens of a galaxy. So those are just three reasons why I think we might need to have our permanent markers in our pockets ready. They're all moments where we can make good decisions and push the human story forward in very positive ways. And it's another thing that motivates me in my writing, because I think the more people are engaged with this, informed, holding our leaders to account, the better chance we have of decisions being made in the interests of the many rather than the 1%.
A big wake-up call for sure, Paul. And we end every show with a segment called The Final Trio, and these are just rapid-fire questions we ask at the end. Before that, where would you send people to connect with you, with all the beautiful work that you're putting together? Obviously, you've talked a little bit about the book. Where would you send people to deep dive further into your world and the way that you see things?
If you go to Amazon and Kindle, you will find Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, Echoes of Eden, The Eden Conspiracy, The Invasion of Eden, and this year, The Eden Enigma. Get hold of my books, and if you want to talk to me about what you find there, you can find me via my website, which is paulanthonywallis.com. I receive messages every day, and I do my very best to begin every day with correspondence and to get into conversation with people. You can find me in video form at The Fifth Kind on YouTube and on the Paul Wallis channel on YouTube, and our other website for The Fifth Kind is fifthkind.tv. And if you become a member there, then we can have some even longer conversations.
Beautiful. For the final trio, These are pretty deep questions. We're just going deeper down the rabbit hole. But the first one is, if you could experience one ancient consciousness technology for yourself, what would you choose and why?
I'm very interested in Plato's Kukion experience. He says this was something, or he strongly hints this was something that Socrates went through, but he describes the effects of it with such interiority. I think it happened to him. I'd want to do that. I want to have the experience he had, because the wisdom that came out of that experience has been world-changing, and his wisdom has lasted the ages. So carefully curated, properly done, I would like to do the Kukion ceremony.
What is the Kukion ceremony?
It's a tea that is a fusion of fermented ingredients and fungal ingredients that essentially is a near-death protocol. It takes you to an altered state of consciousness, and the intention is to enable you to interact with entities or your higher self in ways that you can't in your normal waking state.
So basically, an ayahuasca trip.
I think very similar. I think it's very similar.
Wow.
The thing that worries me about ayahuasca is I don't like vomiting. And I know a lot of people vomit. And I have heard people who've had very bad experiences of that because they just weren't in sufficiently good a place when they did it. And I'm not sure if I could trust myself to be sorted enough to guarantee a really positive experience. But listening to Plato talk about Kukion, that's the one I want to give a go.
So he was basically also contacted then by these entities. If he did that ceremony, then he must have had some crazy conversations with otherworldly beings.
Well, the conclusions he drew were that the entities that you encounter in that altered state of consciousness are the entities who will be coming alongside you when you die and helping you with your life review. And he's a little bit agnostic as to who or what these entities were, whether they were ancestors, interdimensional beings, but they were beings, by his understanding, who are very interested in you and love you and have sort of been in the wings of your life all the time without you realizing it. That's the picture I get from Plato.
Can we still make this tea?
Yes, I think we can. I haven't tried.
Do not try this at home, please.
No, that's why I say properly curated. You really want to do this with someone who knows what they're doing.
Beautiful. For the second question, I wanted to ask, if you had access to the absolute undeniable truth about the origins of humanity, who we are, where we come from, and what we're meant to become, do you think the world is ready for it? Or would it change reality too drastically?
Oh, no. I think people are very hungry for it. The reason I'm so interested in human origins, what the truth really is regarding how we have evolved to what we are, I think a different story of origins immediately changes your understanding of human potential. And I think given a moment, given enough time to breathe, we all feel that we can be more than we are, that we can be more intelligent than we are, more conscious than we are. I think everybody will have had a glimpse of precognition, or a glimpse of a telepathic connection, or an amazing experience of self-healing. And whenever we have these experiences, it throws up the question, oh, wow, could I develop that? And I just think I would love to see people with enough, with the luxury of time and energy to explore those questions, because I believe we can be more. And I think our ancestral story tells us we can be more. And shamanic traditions around the world are there to help people become more than we currently are. So I think we're ready for it. We're hungry for it. And not just for the sake of having more interesting experiences, but I think if we're more intelligent and more conscious, then we will build a more intelligent society. And I think we desperately need to do that in the 21st century.
Yeah, I remember in our first conversation, you said that there was a point in history where we used to be Homo sapiens, sapiens, sapiens three
Yes.
times.
Yes.
And then something happened to ding us back into just sapien, sapien. Are we on that trajectory to add the extra sapien in?
Yes, I think we are for lots of reasons. And the stories that carry that message, if I think of the Efik story from Nigeria or the Mayan story from out of Guatemala, the hint is that if you can clean up your environment, make sure you're drinking clean water, eating clean food, breathing air as clean as you can get, now you're in the place where your higher faculties can begin to thrive again. And I think also I would add to that, if you can get into a place where you're less pressured, because so many of us are so harried and harassed by the need to survive and earn, I think a lot of the time we don't have the luxury to even think about these things. But if we can help one another, you know, if you can help someone take a break, have a holiday, I think that's a tremendous gift. But these other things of cleaning up your environment, I think that's the best thing you can do if you want to begin exploring higher faculties and higher orders of health and possibilities for us moving forward as a species.
Beautifully said. And Paul, for the last question I had for you today is, if you could retrieve just one missing piece of history that is most relevant to our time, what would it be and why?
One missing piece of history. Well, forgive me for promoting my own work as a writer.
Not at all. That's why we're here. You're doing beautiful work.
I think the missing piece of history that I would offer as the key piece of the puzzle is the one I explore in the Eden Conspiracy, because that is the book that shows all the stories of human potential that re-emerge the moment we start reading ancient contact stories as that, rather than as God stories. I think our ancestors, to go back to an earlier point, left a story to teach us not only how life was for them, but how life can be better for us. And the key to doing that is peeling off all our religious thinking when we go to biblical texts and other ancient texts and read the stories for how they were originally intended, because then you will get several pieces of the puzzle that will change everything for you.
Well, brother, it's truly an honor to, and we are so lucky to have people like you on the planet right now that are weaving together so many different things, so many pieces of information that are connecting the dots for so many people, bringing that puzzle into a maybe more visual picture so that we can see what we truly are, where we truly come from, and where we're going. It's an honor to work alongside you, brother. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to peek into the way that you are digging into the ancient mysteries and looking ahead for the future. We are definitely in one of the most exciting times in human history. I can't wait to do this again, probably for book 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, however many are in you. And I know there's definitely a lot more work to be done. So thank you for what you've done up to now. And also thank you for what you're going to be doing in the future.
Oh, thank you, Emilio. I would say exactly the same to you. I do so many interviews from week to week, month to month, year to year, but yours really are a joy. I love the conversations we have. I think your work is superb, and I really wish you every success for the future as well. So thank you for including me in what you do.